Hello and welcome to Turning Point Tactics, the competitive Kill Team 40k podcast and YouTube channel focused on giving you the strategies and tactics to siege initiative every turning point. I'm your host Ryan, and I'm here to help give you tips and tricks to elevate every part of your Kill Team experience. So no matter if you're a casual or competitive player, there should be something here for you. Ultimately, the goal for all of us is to become better opponents and have more fun in the game, and Turning Point Tactics is here to help you do exactly that. Before we begin, I want to give a massive shout out to my patrons. You guys are incredible and I hugely appreciate the support you give me. If not for the support of the patrons, the channel simply wouldn't be what it is. If you too are interested in supporting the channel, there's a few ways you can go about doing so. Firstly, you too can join the Patreon, where you'll get exclusive access to the Discord, Patreon priority questions, early access to content, exclusive content and tournament rewards. Secondly, if you find yourself buying Kill Team goodies or hobby supplies, you can use our affiliate links. This means with every purchase you make, a little bit comes to the channel. It'll cost you nothing, but help keep us and the show going. Finally, you can always support for free without spending a penny. It's as simple as hitting the subscribe button, liking the video, and sharing amongst your local community. Telling your friends about us is a great way to connect the communities together, share lessons, and help elevate everyone's game. As always, we're keen to hear your thoughts and feedback, so don't leave that comment box empty. Let us know what you think, maybe we've missed something, or maybe you have a better strategy. Drop a comment and let us know. Once again, thank you for your support. With all that said, let's get into it. Alrighty, it is Balanced Dataslate time, and we are looking at the very first Balanced Dataslate of 2024, so we're into Q1, and this has been a lot of changes in this Balanced Dataslate, and probably one of the most impactful that we've seen in a while, as I think it addresses a lot of internal balances, some of the points that probably people have been waiting for a little while. There are going to be some surprises, I think, for people, as well as probably some stuff that people did see coming. So hopefully this is going to freshen up the scene a little bit, and we'll see what comes out from it. But overall, I have a pretty positive reaction to this Balanced Dataslate, and we'll just get through and start talking about the various bits, so you can make up your own mind as well. And what we'll always try and do with this is give a little bit of a so what, so not just give you the data because it's kind of boring, but actually try and talk about how I think that affects the game and how it's going to affect you as a player. But clearly that's just my opinion. So if you're there listening at home and you're thinking to me, you know what, I think you've misjudged that, well, put it down in the comments below and I'll get to you, and I'll give my reasoning. We have a bit of forward and back dialogue, but use that comments box. It is a two-way street. All right, so let's get into the first main change. And they have changed the core rules, and it is jump tests are automatically successful, do not roll. This clearly is a direct response to Killzone Beta Decima. I'm not really too sure why they put it in as a core rule rather than just putting it in as the Killzone Beta Decima. I guess because it can appear on open board and it just reduces the stress of the game overall. But it's an interesting one. I just played a tournament actually on Beta Decima terrain over the weekend without jump tests. I think it was good. I don't know. It's hard to quantify what the impact would have been, right? Because I'm sure I would have passed all my jump tests and it never would have been an issue. But equally, had I failed some significant ones and lost a VP and lost a model, then it would have been really, really bad. So this is a good change, in my opinion. I think it's probably the simplest change we can adopt as a community. Most people don't even know jump tests exist. Like for new players, it's not a thing that comes up very often. So just saying to people, yeah, you can just move across these gaps as if they aren't there is probably the best way to go about it. Rather than adding another more complicated rule that doesn't actually exist within the core rule set, I think this is probably the best way and the simplest way of going about and solving that problem, which really sort of showed itself when Beta Decima was released. So let's move on to Beta Decima and talk about some of the changes there. So the first change is restricted line of sight. And the change is the target operative is not visible instead of obscured. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Beta Decima, effectively this was a new rule that came in to try and reduce the shooting gallery effect of the map by making it harder for you to be able to get shots across the hazardous area in the middle. So if you had a distance greater than 4 inches or 2 circle, depends on what your measurement of choice is, then you would be obscured. So now obviously that means that if you're on the kill zone floor and your opponent's on the kill zone floor and you're measuring across that hazardous area and a distance is greater than 4 inches, it's now going to be not visible rather than obscured. But there is a second part of restricted line of sight, which is when you're on a gantry and your line of sight cover line crosses through the box, the sort of 3D area of another gantry to your target beyond, so across the gantry footprint is how they describe it, but it's a sort of 3D area, then that was previously obscured. I assume now that also means it is no longer visible. Now, this is important because lots of teams have abilities that trigger off of being visible rather than, say, being in the kill zone itself or whatever, so, or within a certain range. But what this means is, obviously, is like teams like Pathfinders, who I took at the weekend, they had their Marker Light ability, which they need visibility for, and if you're visible to them, they can apply Marker Light tokens. If you have a certain amount of Marker Light tokens, you can then ignore obscurity, which means at this point, you could then get shots across the hazardous area or through gantry footprints, making it easier to be able to shoot each other across the kill zone. Okay, so let's talk about the so what and how this is going to affect things. It should mean that your deployment zone is a little bit safer in the grand scheme of stuff. You're not going to be able to just get shot from one side of the board to the other by someone just ignoring obscurity, turning point 1, which is a good thing, I guess. Sure, let's say it's a good thing. But what it also means potentially is that those large gantries are going to hide you from visibility, therefore allowing you to have more models on engaged turning point 1. So the large shooty hordes, previously they would have to be very, very careful where they put their models, right? So you would have to not just stick someone where you could ignore obscurity and blast them on turning point 1, so you'd have to be hiding, potentially block in somewhere that blocks visibility naturally with like solid plastic or some sort of end of a gantry position. Whereas now, obviously, you can just use the gantry itself to ignore that. And even if you were to go up onto the vantage point, that would still be not visible rather than obscured, and therefore you can potentially have guys in your deployment zone pretty safe on engage and no worries, which I think is broadly a positive change for Beta Decima. One of the issues that I think there was with the game, or with the terrain, the kill zone itself, sorry, better word. So the issue I had with the kill zone was the deployment zones felt a little bit too easy to shoot into, and it was a bit hard to deploy. So it was quite punishing for new players. You can make a quite an easy mistake and suddenly be losing a lot of models without necessarily expecting it. However, a big benefit of Beta Decima was that everyone said it was going to counter the melee teams and that sort of stuff. Well, now you've just given melee teams a whole bunch of extra areas to hide. And actually, with the amount of gantries that we see across the map, there's going to be a lot of visibility blocking terrain that doesn't necessarily appear to be blocking visibility, if that makes sense. So this could be a very interesting one where I think I might personally describe Beta Decima as one of the least beginner-friendly maps or kill zones right now, because what you're going to say to someone is, hey, there's a rule, right, called visibility, which is if you can see a model from your model, it's visible no matter what, unless, of course, you're looking through a footprint of a gantry, or if you're on the ground and you're looking and it's greater than 4 inches over the water, and then someone's going to go, I don't really understand. And then you go, cool, don't worry about it. Now we have to worry about obscurity on top of this, as well as other things as well. So this is definitely going to be interesting when it comes to determining line of sight. And I don't necessarily know if it's going to be too punishing for either way, because one of the points that I found personally when I was playing Beta Decima, and some people have different play experiences, so this is just the world according to Ryan, but like one of the main strengths that I found of using, say, Pathfinders was not necessarily just shooting across the hazardous area, which was a benefit, being able to do that for sure, and applying pressure in that way. But mainly, actually, it was the fact that you can apply pressure on all the objectives, because the objectives are, or on a lot of the maps, not all of them, but on a lot of the maps, they're actually on the gantries themselves, and therefore they are not protected by this mechanic at all. So as soon as you get up onto that gantry, you are then effectively exposed, and the only terrain you can place there is a barricade, unless there's scatter terrain in your map pack on those objectives, and the barricade is light terrain. So for teams such as the Vet Guard Spotter, or for Pathfinders, or any team that can remove light terrain effectively, this is still really good for them, because you don't necessarily need to alpha strike someone right in their deployment zone, right? What you need to do is deny them their ability to score primary, and the best way of denying them to score primary is killing the guys that make it to the objectives. And note that for a lot of these missions, you have to potentially have a large investment into getting people up to those objectives, because of how far away they are. Maybe you need equipment like climbing equipment to be able to give you the movement potential to reach it. Maybe you need to forward deploy someone. Maybe you need to give them an extra APL to do the action on the objective, wherever it needs to be. So teams that can get around those sorts of abilities are going to do really well on this. So I'll be interested to see how it plays. I personally don't think it's necessarily going to change some of the core issues that I think exist within the game. I think the primary objective is too hard to reach. Therefore, if you play it in a mixed format tournament and you're not all in the same round, then you're going to see a reduction in primary for players, because they just, unless they have a very mobile team, they cannot have the movement potential and the action potential to reach all the objectives and score, say, a 4-2 turning point 1, a 3-3, or even get 2 points in some instances. So that's one point. Or if they do, they're going to get massively punished because they're effectively running into light terrain at best, or potentially just completely open spaces. So interestingly, that there will be a few changes to this. So if you play one of the maps where the majority of objectives are actually on the ground, then it's suddenly going to become, I think, quite favourable for your melee teams, because now you can actually move up relatively safe, and they should struggle to be able to shoot you at range, at least. And then the way the map design works is you're sort of funneled into various funnels anyway. I'm interested to see how this one plays. It's probably not how I would have gone about solving it. I think, it'll be interesting to see, because there's quite a few abilities that trigger off being visible. So I know you're probably all thinking, oh, you're just talking about a Pathfinder here as a Pathfinder player, but that's not really what I care about. What I'm just talking about generally is if you have any sort of ability to be able to manipulate an enemy or operative based on visibility, you're not going to be able to do that, which, maybe that's a great thing. Let's see how it plays out, I guess. There is a second change to Killzone Beta Decima, which I'll talk about now, which is if you're using a tactical ploy, such as Sneaky Git or Dimensional Translocation for High-Tech Circle, anything that lets you set up outside of your drop zone effectively, then you can no longer do so anywhere you want. Instead, it has to be wholly within 4 inches of your drop zones. That's quite a significant reduction for a lot of teams. And there's teams as well that you're probably not thinking about that are affected by this, like Wormblade, which were doing really well in Beta Decima, actually. I think they had a lot of very complementary abilities for that terrain set. Less so now, potentially. Now we've seen that they have that change to visibility rather than obscured, etc., etc. And with this nerf as well. The interesting thing with this, though, is, and this is something that I haven't seen fixed yet, but it says here, tactical ploys that allow one or more operatives to be set up outside your drop zone. Note that Pathfinders with their drones, that is not a tactical ploy, it's a ability on an operative, so that still goes through this. So if they were hoping to nerf all forward deploys, then that hasn't really been achieved, but that this will affect some teams more than others. Note that, like Exaction Squad, it's not a tactical ploy, it's an ability, so they should be able to still move their guys forward as well. I guess the main so what of this is we're going to see less people being able to just get up the board really, really quickly and score objectives really fast, which generically I think is probably a good thing, but also, again, it's going to contribute to that reduction in primary for a lot of teams. I guess my overall thoughts on Killzone Beta Decima is it is still going to have some teams perform better than others. If you have a way to be able to increase your movement potential and overcome the vantage problem, if you're playing with a lot of objectives on the vantage points and on the gantries and higher, then you're going to be able to perform better and you'll be able to score higher than your opponent. If you don't have that ability, then you're going to struggle. The way it's going to play is going to feel really wacky, I think, and it's going to be difficult for people to understand initially, particularly for new players, and it's going to play very, very differently to the other maps, which for some people is really, really good. You know, that's awesome. It plays differently and all that sort of stuff. For other people, that might be really bad, right? Because if you're going for a very competitive experience at a tournament and you want to be, and you're using any sort of placing and pairing metric that are based upon points or VP or TAC ops, whatever, then you have to understand how this terrain is going to potentially impact that. So this probably leans, again, more towards, if you're doing a mixed tournament, you might want to think about opponent win percentage, route to victory, all sorts of other options, strength of schedule, rather than potentially those point scoring options, because someone could just draw Beta Decima 4 times in a row, right? And if they didn't have a team that could actually score particularly well on it, then suddenly they're really struggling. Alrighty, so let's get into some of the team changes. I'm going to be starting looking at commandos, or Kill Team Octarius, but commandos first. Let's talk about them. So 3 main changes that they have is a change to the bomb squig, which is making its blast ability, its ability to self-detonate and explode, only work within engagement range rather than 2 inches. Now this is actually somewhat interesting because although, yeah, sure, it's just a simple range reduction, that's fine. That's not too exciting. I mean, it's helpful and it is a nerf. But it actually lets you have a lot more counterplay with barricades. So if anyone's watched a lot of my videos or see me play on any of the live streams and like that, you see that I like to use counter melee barricades quite a lot, particularly in things like ITD. I find they can be really impactful. And that's where you put a barricade down in a certain area and you sit yourself just within 1 inch of your side of the barricade. And therefore, because of the width of the barricade, it's impossible for an opponent's model to get within 1 inch from their side of the barricade. And you can do this in some very sneaky ways on ITD. Based on the width of a corridor, you can make it so that there's no way to be charged, and effectively you can only be shot. And against commandos, like, one of the big counters to that was having a bomb squig just hiding around the corner. So if you went and put yourself in a counter melee barricade position, they would yeet the bomb squig around the corner the next turn, blow it within 2 inches of you because they can touch the barricade and that is within 2 inches of you, it's not within 1 inch of you, and then suddenly, boom, you're dead. But now they can't do that. So that's like an interesting change of how you can use your barricades to potentially zone out the bomb squig a little bit better. And noting that it's already been nerfed from the APL modification, which has a slight reduction in range. So really now the bomb squig has been taken from this sort of 11-inch bullet that just yeeted forward and moved dash with an APL buff and just exploded within 2 inches into now this melee monster that's now going to be like a one-way melee attack drone. So still quite interesting, and I can still see people getting caught out by it because if it does get into engagement range of multiple models, it's going to potentially take some people out, but it's going to be harder to position for. And with the bomb squig being on a 25mm base, that's effectively just under 1 inch, so it's got an inch either side of that. So let's say it's roughly 2.9 inches. So your opponent's going to have to space their models 3 inches apart to avoid a double charge explode from the bomb squig. So it's still going to have that effect of, I think, zoning out areas and forcing your opponent to space appropriately, but it's going to be in a subtly different way in which it worked before. But that's not the only nerfs that Commando has received. Another nerf is that the chopper equipment now has 1 fewer attacks, so it's down to 3 attacks rather than 4. Now, this is an interesting point on commandos because one of the issues that they've always had historically is reliability in melee. And I know what people will say, they have 4 attacks hitting on 3s and it's 4 or 5 damage. Like that is reliable melee. I think you have to play with them like across multiple tournaments and roll those dice against people and see how many times you get let down, how many times you have to waste your CP re-rolling them to realise that actually you need 3 hits, right? So you need to get 3 hits because your opponent's going to get a hit and parry, and therefore if you only get 2, you're only doing 4 damage, and that's not enough to kill most operatives in the game. So you need 3 hits. That's difficult on on 4 dice on a 3-up. On 3 dice on a 3-up, that is going to be, well, I mean, that is going to absolutely tank their reliability. In fact, let's put some numbers on it, right? So when you have 4 attacks, if you're trying to kill a guardsman equivalent model, you've got a 63.8% chance to kill them. And when you're dropping that down to just 3 attacks, suddenly you're at a 36.4% chance. So that's a significant reduction in reliability of trying to kill an enemy guardsman-like model. And we can debate stronger models and that sort of stuff, but I'm just going with the easy numbers here. So that is a significant reduction in ability. So I guess the question is, like, what are Commando players going to do to get around this? And I think you're probably going to see that the chopper is taken less often, right? So the standard boys will keep their choppers because they're unaffected, right? So don't worry about those. But what you'll probably see instead is maybe the sledgehammer being taken. So the sledgehammer, for those of you who don't know, because it was never got taken before, is 3 equipment points. It hits on 3s, it's 4 damage, and it has stun, but importantly it has 4 attacks. Now this can only be taken twice because it is limited for the commandos. They can only take it 2 times. But previously you'd probably see people running 3 choppers. I think now, rather than 3 choppers, you'll see them just taking 2 sledgehammers, which doesn't really change much, to be honest. In fact, the stun keyword increases their chance of killing a 7 wound model, because now if you get a crit, you can hit and parry concurrently at the same time. So potentially, if you get a crit and a hit, and your opponent only gets 1 hit, you can crit them, remove their hit, and suddenly you're good to go, right? So weirdly, it increases their kill percentage chance to about 66.5% or 6%. So what we're seeing there is, I think, is a reduction in the number of choppers, people taking different equipment, which isn't a bad thing. And this comes onto a bit of internal balance, right? So now people are actually looking at probably other options that exist within their list, but it wouldn't surprise me if you see something like 2 sledgehammers and a dynamite, or 2 sledgehammers and some climbing rope, or whatever it's going to be. So and they'll figure it out. Maybe they'll take some smoke grenades or whatever. But generically, I think the option of spamming choppers per se now probably won't be taken as much. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of the other things that are out there, or changes. So they've changed the Just a Scratch ploy as well. So firstly, it excludes the bomb squig, which is a nice change, because previously that thing would just run into the midboard, be in a smoke grenade, you then shoot it at the start and it just wouldn't die, and then it would go off and kill someone like an absolute missile. But so it excludes that, which is one little nerf. So the grot and the bomb squig no longer work for Just a Scratch. Hooray. And also, it only works now versus normal damage rather than critical damage. So when a damage will be inflicted from a normal hit only, which is I can't describe how useful this is for a lot of teams, right? So melee teams with power swords and that sort of stuff, you always had the issue that you needed that first crit damage to be able to create the break point that you needed, to then let the follow-up normal hit work. So perfect example, you're charging a boy with a power weapon, lethal 5, you needed to do 6 damage so that your regular 4 damage would kill them, right, because they're 10 wounds base. So that then allows you now to have a play around with breakpoints, and suddenly you can go, alright, well, I'm going to hit you with this crit, which you can't do anything about, you get to hit me, but then I get to then kill you. I know they can still Just a Scratch, but if you have multiple hits, there's a chance there now where you can actually kill that model before they can just a Scratch the main damage away, right? Because that's what it was in the past, is they would Just a Scratch your 6 damage, and now on your remaining attacks, however many you had, you didn't even have sufficient damage to kill the model. So you were probably going to die, and there was nothing you could do about it. So this is a really good change, and one that I really like. However, I will say, I think this is going to punish both the competitive players and the new players of the faction, right? So at the top tier, everyone was taking 4 CP for Just a Scratch, and they were sort of leaving that aside for every turning point, so they knew that they had it available to themselves going forwards. Then they would spend on their forward deploys and whatever else. Some of the more casual players probably would have spent their CP a little bit more extravagantly in the first few turning points, and would get to turning point 3 and 4 without any CP, and therefore wouldn't be able to do this. But it was probably one of their main ploys to go to increase their survivability should they want to, and that's now not an option for them. Whereas, you know, I think when we look at the very competitive tables, things that we see people doing was using the sneaky git, followed by like the shush abilities, followed by the smoke grenades, to have a lot of early board control and really, really clamp down on your ability to score primary and dominate objectives early on, right? So that, in this instance, has not been changed, but what has been changed is your ability to kill those models on the objectives once they get there, which usually would be in melee. So from like let's say, looking from the Star Shrine's perspective, that was a matchup I thought was almost impossible previously. Now your Assassin and now Vayne has a chance to potentially go and do significant damage to commandos that are hiding in smoke grenades, and maybe you have a chance then to be able to remove them from those midfield objectives. However, and I do caveat this, however, they still have the ability to in ITD used the shush ploy to move their entire kill team up into the line of the ITD board and get into a position where they can suddenly reach all the objectives with all their threats and all of them can charge and conceal. So turning point 1, you have a real significant problem being able to deal with them. So this is good. This is also bad in a sense that I think it's going to hurt a lot of the newer players with commandos significantly more than it's going to hurt the competitive players, because for the competitive players, I think a lot of the strategies that they were using previously still remain valid, right? So they're still using their bomb squig and their commando grot to give them the extra activation, to have activation advantage and get the last maneuver in a turning point 1. They're still using their shooting models in the same way, holding them back, creating angles, not necessarily charge them in with choppers, but using their ability to sort of keep you back and threat range you and force you to respect their shooting, and then they are still going to be use their shush ploy and their forward deploys to be able to get that early or forward deploy singular, to be able to get that early board presence going forward. So commanders are definitely hit by this, and it is no understatement that the damage just a scratch is significant. It is going to make them much easier to play around, but I'm just saying, let's not count them out just yet. Let's see how they play over the next few months, unless all the competitive players drop them. But I don't think commanders are dead, put it that way. I think they're going to do fine. I think just the previous ways of playing them might need to be adapted slightly. You might be taking slightly different equipment. You might be playing things slightly differently, and maybe you won't be quite so nonchalant about just throwing boys into models with power swords and just laughing as no one dies. So that might now change, which is, I think, probably overall a good change for the game, but just for the more casual players, I'm sorry, the just a scratch probably hurts quite a lot, but needed. There is another change for Octarius teams though, which has probably been a very long time coming, and I am surprised it hasn't turned up sooner, but here we are. So we're looking at veteran guardsmen, and there is 3 changes to this kill team, and really I think this hits all the feel bads of the kill team, which is probably a good thing, right? So firstly, let's talk about the spotter. So the spotter ability previously let you select a model and treat them as if they're on engage order for another model within 2 inches of your spotter, right? And that was really, really cool because it meant that you can get a sniper just to kill any model on your opponent's team before they had a chance to react. And that was a really fun, engaging way to play the game, and no one had any issues with it. But you could also do something like, fire a frag grenade into a group of enemies that thought they were safe, or whatever. So they have now changed that, and it is you can't do it to operatives in heavy terrain. So now there's sort of 2 counterplays to the spotter, and I like the fact that they've added it up, because previously it was only really using obscurity, which from a map design perspective, by the way, was an absolute nightmare to make sure you tried to make stuff safe. But now it's either you're in heavy terrain or you're obscured. So between the 2 of those, you're good, and it kind of gives the spotter a slightly more niche role. Maybe they're not quite as auto-included as they used to be, but that's probably a good thing, right? There is another change as well. So the demolition veteran has been hit twice. So firstly, the range of the demo bomb is down from 3 down to 2, or from blue square down to white circle, again depending upon your preference on measurement metrics. And also, an operative cannot be a valid target if heavy terrain is wholly intervening. And that means you must be able to draw on a cover line from the centre of the mine token to any part of the intended space without crossing heavy terrain. So this is kind of like, is your mine visible? Kind of like is a way to think of it. Is it visible to the model's base without going through heavy terrain? This is quite nice, right? Because This I think is going to significantly reduce the board presence that Vet Guard have. So in the past, you'd move up into what you think was heavy, your door block or something like that, and they could just blow you away. And some of the area denial techniques that Vet Guard had available to them was huge. So they could do that in one area and deny like a central piece of cover. And then they could use their sniper spotter to deny another area, and then before you know it, there's really nowhere you can move up safely onto an objective without taking casualties. And the problem with that is that they're a 14 model team, and so therefore, if you're losing the attritional game with them, you're in a terrible position going forwards, right? So the other thing they could do, so this is one method of area denial that was really strong to Vet Guard. So they had the demo and the spotter effectively denying you either a grouping of heavy terrain or an area or an objective where it was going to be. But then they also had just the sheer bodies to also throw on objectives, right? So they can use like APL to bully you on an objective, and then have GA2 to be able to steal loot objectives from underneath you and deal damage concurrently with, say, like a crack grenade, whilst doing this area denial with these other two means. So now they're going to have to sort of balance those priorities. They're not going to be able to hit quite as much quite so easily with both their spotter and their demo. And the other change that they've made, which I quite like, is the demo veterans plant mine action can only be performed once per game. Usually this I'm not gonna lie, didn't normally come up too much. The demo veteran would do their thing and then they become like a number one priority of death. But if it did come up, it really hurt, where you just got demo mined again on the next turning point. And the way I saw this usually appearing was through like doors. So if you left the door unblocked, they could jump out the other side of a door, plant a mine, jump back through the door, and then blow up. Or in that sort of scenario where they had like the ability to hide themselves, that now is significantly harder. Well, it's impossible for them to do. They can't blow you up on the door, so you can go body block them, which is nice. And they can't place the mine multiple times. So that's, I think, is a win for the competitive community, because Vetguard were actually really, really strong. And I think they're a difficult team to play. A lot of people potentially didn't see all of the options available to them. But when you're playing against a good player with Vetguard and they were stacking all this stuff against you, it can feel really, really painful. So I'm personally a big fan of these changes. What I'm a bit sad about, though, if I'm totally honest, is where I think they've done a good job with some of the other teams of taking away with one hand but giving with another. I think Vetguard could have done with that. And what I mean by that is just taking some of the less picked operatives and maybe making them a little bit better. So, for instance, the Bruiser veteran, right, is probably, well, you're probably going, who's that? I've never heard of him. He's the guy that's got like a trench club in their team, and the reason why no one ever takes him is because he's only got three attacks hitting on threes. Rip to commandos with their choppers. But this is the point, right? So making him say 4 attacks would be a cool thing. So rather than just saying, here's some of your key abilities, and I've taken away those, like give them another tool that's different, right? Because that team's been out a while now, so they've been quite stale. And I think giving them a little bit of a lease of life or a different way of playing them would be a good way of getting around it. So, and I think maybe a little bit more melee for them would be interesting, like making the Confidant have his chainsword have 4/5 damage rather than the 3/4. All the other chainswords in the game are 4/5, so just stick that with it, and maybe pushing like the Zealot up to 4 attacks on his bayonet. I say Zealot, I meant Hardened Veteran on his bionic arm, but you know what I mean. But just giving them a completely different flavour of way to deal with some of these problems, I think would be really interesting, because they've had a very stagnant play style for a while. That's now definitely been hit, and I think it is going to be impactful. But what we haven't done here is give Vetguard players a oh yeah, that's something that I want to go play with, right? And that's a really important point, I think, to draw people to play teams. Is what will get competitive players back to this team is a new ability or a new way to play, a new problem to solve, and they'll go and do that. Whereas when they look at this now, they're going to go, yeah, I don't really like those things. That was the way I played that team, and they're not going to look for a different way to play it, in my opinion. So in the next one, maybe in 3 months' time, when Vetguard is my prediction, win rate drops as a result, because players will move away from the team because they have been nerfed. That's like a human reaction. And compounding that, additionally, the abilities of the team have become weaker. So I would imagine we'll see that their win rate will drop, and then we'll be asking for buffs. So that's the sort of buffs that I would like to see, is give them a subtly different way of playing, and that could be good fun. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, next we've got the Void Dancer Troop, and they've been hit with a nerf as well. So all of the operatives need to remove the fly keyword, and they gain the following ability: Flip Belts. This operative has the fly keyword for the purposes of moving around, across, and over other operatives. However, each time this operative is climbing or dropping, treat the total vertical distance as 2 or a white circle. Okay, so what does this mean? So this means that in the past, you could just move effectively from wherever you were on the kill zone, 9 inches in a straight line over your Octarius walls, over your Chalnath walls, wherever it's going to be, and you ignore all of them. But this is now quite important because there is some significant changes, right? So, firstly, traversing isn't counted here as being climbing or dropping. So that means that barricades are now relevant for Void Dancer troop players. Their own barricades to hide behind when they're using Domino Fill, but also your opponent's barricades. This is going to significantly reduce their threat ranges because they're usually going to be in some kind of cover. So they're now going to have to move around that cover or over that cover where it's going to be. But either way, it's going to cost them 2, right? So they can be hiding behind a big brick wall. It's going to cost them 2 to climb it. Or they can be hiding behind a traverse. It's going to cost them 2 either way, right? So that's a big change. But I do want to focus on the wording of this just a little bit closer. So, however, each time this operative is climbing or dropping, treat the total vertical distance as 2 white. Now, a climb is different action to a drop. So the way I'm reading this is if you climb something, no matter how tall it is, you're going to be paying a 2-inch tax. And if you drop off of something, no matter how far down it is, you're going to be paying a 2-inch tax. So this is important because previously you could stand behind a Octarius wall, say, an L shape, and you'd be able to go from behind it 9 inches directly forwards to wherever you wanted to be able to go to. Now you're going to have to pay 2 inches to go up, and you have to pay 2 inches to go down, meaning your total horizontal movement is actually only going to be 5 inches. That is a significant reduction in how far you can go up the board with this kill team. So now the Void Dancer troop's movement potential is massively restricted. That's, I think, a good thing, and I'm not against this at all. And note that this is going to stack with some of the other things that we'll come on to. That any team that can sort of restrict your movement ability with abilities, whatever that might be, this is going to stack with that as well. So suddenly you can now significantly impact how far these Harlequin players can move in a single activation, which is quite significant. That combined with the traverse means that on things like Into the Dark, you now have a better way of slowing down Void Dancers from being able to move up the board, and it's going to significantly hurt their ability to just move forth and do damage. Note as well that for things like the Death Jester and their ability to move up onto mid-board height and do shooting attacks from vantage in Turning Point 1, again, this is going to be a lot harder for them to do because they have to be paying for all that movement potential to get up there. So this is quite a lot of significant changes, or it's a single change, but significantly changes the way in which the team plays, because Void Dancer Troop has always been a movement-based team, right? So they're reliant on short-range weapons outside the Death Jester, nice easy to say for me, and also their ability to get in combat and charge and do quite aggressive spike damage because they're effectively a fragile glass cannon kind of faction. So what they've always wanted to be able to do is charge, kill someone, shoot someone else, get double kills, or play the objective really well, and that's their sort of their game plan. But now they might not have the movement potential to be able to set up the line of sight they need with their pistol for the subsequent attack or whatever, right? So just it's an interesting change to the way the team's going to play, and I think it gives your opponent more agency to be able to figure out a way to work around them, because now effectively you can use your barricades in a defensive manner, which you haven't been able to before. Note obviously that they can still move over your models, so they still have that ability, but they're not quite as aggressively fast as they used to be. And what's going to be interesting for this actually is for some of the other teams like Blades of Cain and Corsairs that usually struggle against this team, and it's been a very hard matchup for them. I think this helps level the playing field quite significantly, because now you can actually range them out, and now it's easier to predict their threat ranges, right? So in the past you'd be like, well, you could probably go over there, you could probably go over there, I can't do much about it because it's just so far. Now you can see actually where can they get to. Maybe if I place some barricades in the right place, it's going to reduce that avenue or that attack vector where it's going to be, and suddenly you can control maybe where these clowns are coming from. So that's quite an interesting change for the competitive scene, in my opinion. The next change I'm just going to really briefly touch on is Wormblade. It's not a change, right? It is just they tidied up the wording of the first bullet point, so that I don't know if people remember in the past it was like, oh, if every single model on my team can't see your one model, you don't get cult ambush. And I think rules intended was pretty obvious, but rules as written was dubious. They've just made it so that rules as written actually reads properly now. So that tidies up that, which is a nice change just to have, I guess, complete and keep the team on track. So let's move on to Warp Coven, because there has been, wow, a lot of changes. So the first thing, okay, so I'm going to talk about Warp Coven. This team has historically always struggled, right? And it's struggled for a bunch of reasons. I think it struggled to score on primary. And I think there was the main reason for that was APL efficiency versus like model count, and you needed the Zangors. But they weren't doing too much damage. They're doing a bit of it, but not too much. They became like your, I guess, sort of like mission bodies, and then your sorcerers were reliant to do all of your damage output. The rubrics weren't very efficient, so you couldn't really use them very well, but they're the easiest way of playing the team. And they've tried over the course of their buffs and stuff to address each of these points. Another one of the issues they had historically was they were really not very good at scoring secondaries either, because of the fact they had to be either locked into recon or security, and to be able to achieve that you had to select exactly the right number of operatives, be it Zangors or Rubric Marines. So that's now been removed as well. So that was previous. So they were, getting better, but still not particularly good. And one of the issues I found is that they were particularly CP hungry. They had a lot of good abilities, but you had to sort of use them all the time, and they just didn't have enough CP, right? So the first change that they've made is the Exalted Astartes strategic ploy, which is now 0 CP, and you add the following. So in addition, until the end of the turning point, each no-friendly Root Marine operative is activated does not perform a fight action. During activation, you perform 2 shoot actions. If it's gunner operative, 1 additional action point must be subtracted to perform the second shoot action. So that is the same change that they had previously, but now it is 0 CP. So that means that you can get these guys out the rubrics, shooting twice. You can use the warp portal to get people into good positions and insert a good amount of volume fire on shield targets, and it just means that you're not spending that CP to make your Marines APL efficient, which is good. The next change that they've made is to the Sorcerer's command ability. So they changed this previously, which was effectively everyone starts at 3 APL now, and you then reduce your APL if you're not close enough to a sorcerer. In the past, it was you start at 2 APL and increase your APL if you were close to a sorcerer. This lets them hold onto objectives better, right? So their static APL is 3, and then when they activate, they either reduce their APL if they're not close enough, which is good for their security tac ops and their ability to score primary. That used to be 6 inches. Now, obviously, they've made that into 9 inches. Red pentagon plus blue 9, or just a standard red with what it was previously. So that's a good change, right? So what they're trying to do here is allow you to spread out your resources more across the kill zone, because again, what happened was you ended up getting people tied really close together because the rubric couldn't really split too far away from your sorcerer. But the difficulty with that was your sorcerer is effectively quite a good close range melee model with some shooting powers, but predominantly they want to be moving forward quite quickly, getting angles and doing damage up the board. But then you had your rubrics who were quite slow and did long range damage from shooting. So these two models had to remain close to each other whilst having sort of different objectives that they were trying to achieve. So just making that 9 inches is a significant increase on aura size, and should really mean that you're fine from this ability. And it also means that you can have a single sorcerer controlling multiple rubrics, which is good, right? So you can potentially hold one guy back. He's in between 2 rubrics that are 9 inches either side of him, and away you go. So a nice little change there. I think that's going to help them be able to make rubrics slightly more efficient, which is always good. The next change is adding 1 to the wounds characteristic of Zangors. This is actually a really significant buff because it takes them from the 8 wound breakpoint up to a 9 wound breakpoint, and this means that I think you're going to see Zangors living on 1 wound a lot, right? Because all of the 4 damage weapons that are out there, we're seeing that they're becoming more and more prolific and more common. You now need probably a crit and a hit to go through to actually kill a Zangor, whereas previously it would just be 2 hits, right? So that is significant. Additionally, when you see them fight in melee, and these Zangors are primarily melee models, exactly in the same way, if you're fighting against a sort of a 4 damage weapon, you're now getting your 3rd hit in, which can, for them, mean that they can hit up to, say, 12 damage, enough to contest with Marines or something like that. Again, a really nice change for them. I admit, against Marines, they're probably just going to parry you out, but just something to be aware of, that's a good change, which means that you're not going to die quite as easily as you would do normally. The next major change is to their psychic powers itself. So change all instances of the end of the turning point to the start of this operative's next activation until it's incapacitated or until this psychic power is selected again, whichever comes first. So this is a really nice change, and this is what they did for the higher tech circle, and it means that some of your abilities now become a lot more impactful. So that the standard one that probably everyone saw previously was ephemeral instability, which has also received a slight nerf. But what that does is it means that you subtract 1 inch now, it was previously 2 inches, from distances that you can charge and dash. That's a pretty good buff, particularly to have lasting over turning point. So one of the points where this was where it didn't come up but now will is in the strategic phase. So a lot of the time you would pop your ephemeral instability, it would end at the end of the turning point, and then in the strategic phase your opponent could do like a dash ability, and they'll be moving their full range of their dash. Now they can't do that. So they can, but they're moving 1 inch less. So it still applies there, which is quite nice. Note that it won't work obviously for the very first turning point because you haven't had a chance to pop it just yet. But they also have a few other options for this. So they have ability to effectively get relentless against a single target. So being able to pull that from one turning point over to the next turning point is going to be really nice, right? Because you can effectively end up stacking it twice in turning point 2, because you can activate it. Let's say it's one of your last activations on turning point 1, and then one of your last, or midway through turning point 2, you do it again and you give it to someone else, and suddenly you can now go, yep, bam, you're going to get this this double relentless off, which can be quite nice. The one that I think is actually quite sneaky, and I'm really like a fan of, but maybe it's just me being mean. But they have another one called Twist Destiny, right? And this is where each time you have an enemy operative that either fights in combat or makes a shooting attack, they cannot reroll their attack dice, and that's the first bit. But the second bit is the operative ignores all positive modifiers to its APL, and where this can be quite good, in my opinion, is against teams like Breachers and Star Striders, and any sort of team that can sort of ad hoc just increase the APL of an operative. So let's say you see their Grenadier, right, and you can see that they've positioned them, they've given them a com buff, or they set them up within 3 inches of another model, ready to potentially go, yep, I'm going to +1 APL on the blitz, and I'm going to give them into the breach, and suddenly, boom, 3 over, this guy's going to run forward and melt a dude. You can just go, well, you're visible to me, so now you're not going to get any rerolls when you fight or do anything, and also you ignore all positive modifiers to its APL until I have my next activation. And that's a really good way of being able to deny those sorts of models that that winning the initiative and like first turning point, yeet forwards and do damage, while you just go, nope, I'm protected against that, and there's not much you can do against it. Another cool thing they can do is Weave Fate, which is basically just a defense version, and it's like you get relentless on your defense dice, which for some of your rubrics with their sort of like 5+ invulnerable saves, that could be quite impactful, right? Because if you know you're putting them into an area where they could be potentially exposed, and you're a bit worried about that happening, suddenly having a relentless on your 5-up, and let's say you're in cover, well, I'm going to retain 1, roll 2 5-ups and roll them again if it doesn't go well, that plasma gun suddenly ain't doing as much damage as they thought it was going to, and that can be really quite impactful. So I think that's a great change in my opinion. That gives a team a bunch of new options. Again, you're reducing how each of those models are sort of forced to play with each other, and they can spread out a bit more now. And so I'll be interested to see how this sort of team plays on things like Beta Decima, because You can obviously have a model that flies, it has 3 APL, but you're not necessarily going to have the visibility to get those long range shots. But this team kind of plays well into that, right? Because they have a lot of melee models that they want to move up the board, and can use it to potentially hide quite well. The other change that they've done as well is the arcane robes, and that's probably one of the equipment pieces that I saw people taking more often than not. It's for the sorcerers only, and what it does is let you take a crit damage and make it into normal damage. So this was, I think, quite useful particularly for the sorcerers when they were going into melee, because you would fight, say, someone with like a power sword, and you know that you're going to be taking, say, 6 damage, and that's a lot to take on one of your sort of main models. Well, actually now just being able to go, actually once per turning point, I'm going to force that into a regular hit. It means that equipment goes much, much further, right? Because now you can be using it 4 times potentially, and each time you do it, you're reducing the damage by, say, 2, or in some instances it can be as much as 3. But like that, reducing that crit damage by that much means that now you go, oh, you know what? This is actually a good place to be in, and your sorcerers, who are your key models that need to do work, can potentially have, you know, let's say 15, 16, 18 wounds in comparison by having this piece of equipment. So it can be, against the right opponents and the right models, really, really impactful at keeping your models alive, and allowing you to do more damage and more output with them, which Warp Coven did need. So do I think this is going to be enough for Warp Coven? I don't know. I think it's definitely going to make them interesting. Weirdly, if I was to say, like, what do I think is going to be the most impactful of all of these changes? Most of you might be thinking, yeah, it's probably the psychic powers. It's probably the Rubik Marines, like, free ploys. I actually think it's probably the Zangors getting that 9th wound, because they've always been kind of good at melee. Like, kind of, they're fine, but they're also very fragile. And they were a key to unlocking the team's potential, I think, because you needed them in so many missions and matchups to give you the right amount of activations to go forward and do the things you need to do. And them now being 9 wounds just means that you're going to be able to hang around more, play the mission better, and do better with them. Now, this is my opinion. I haven't played Warp Coven that much though, so I'm going to reach out to some ninjas on the Warp Coven community. In fact, they're already reaching out to me in the Discord. I am going to get to them. I just wanted to make sure I record this and get it to the patrons tonight, because that they want to hear it on the day, right? So once I finish recording this, I'll go and chat to them. But this is my initial gut reaction, and I'll try and get them on the show to talk through potentially their experiences, and particularly if they get some tournament experience, and maybe just prove the assumptions that I'm thinking in my mind. So some interesting changes to Warp Coven there. So let's move on to the next kill team and talk about the Farstalker Kin Band. This is a team that has had so many changes. It's really difficult to keep track of, but let's go and talk through the first one. So the first one is going to be the Kill Broker, and a Ritual Blade equipment. We need to add one to the attacks characteristic. This is actually a really cool change, right? So the leader always sort of lacked any sort of real luster. Like they weren't particularly killy, they weren't particularly interesting. They were just a dude, right? Now they can take this equipment, which I think you're probably always going to take now. It's only 2 EP, and it's going to give you 4 attacks hitting on 2s and 4/5 damage, which is a nice profile. And note that when you then end up doing the Cutthroat Strategic Ploy, that's going to be going up to 5 attacks. That I think is a very competitive melee fighter, and he's actually going to be able to potentially hold his own in a lot of fights, right? So being 9 wounds, having access potentially to Ceaseless if you're attacking the right model, with his Call the Kill ability, so you could be Ceaseless, you're hitting on 2s, you're 4/5 damage with 5 attacks, you should be able to take apart any real like 8 wound model quite efficiently. So that's pretty cool, right? So it's given him an ability to have some offensive characteristic as well as his generic Call the Kill ability, and I think that's, for me, a good buff to see for him. The other change is the Kroot Stalker. So he's also gained an attack, and this was one of those weird ones because he was previously only 3 attacks, so now we're up to 4 attacks, which is cool because his special ability, right? So he's gonna be 4 attacks, hitting on 3s, 3/4 balance and rending, and he has a stealth attack ability, right? So if he spends 2 AP and he's on a conceal within 1 inch of terrain, he can do a charge, but only 6 inches, then do a free fight. But the interesting thing about this is you can resolve 2 hits, like one immediately after the other, right? So that is really good when you have more attacks, because one of the issues that I found when people had, if you had it on just 3 attacks, admittedly with balanced, you might get 2 or 3 hits, and it wouldn't be too good, and you're less likely to trigger a rending. However, now with 4 attacks base, up to 5 attacks on your cutthroats, with balance, you're effectively rolling 6 dice, and if you get a 6, you can now make that into 2 6s with rending, which is now far more likely. Boom, suddenly you can be putting through 8 damage without taking any damage back, and that I think is a significant kill potential, and really going to help them against those 8 wound model teams. Not necessarily that I was thinking that's what they were struggling with in the first place, but a good change. I'm a fan of it. It's a straight up damage buff for both the Killbroker and the Stalker. The next change that they made is the Hound Operative, and they're changing the GA characteristic to 1. So this is a buff, but also potentially a nerf. The way this is going to help you is in Turning Point 1. And it's probably going to hinder you on turning points 2, 3, and 4. I mean, probably turning points 2 and 3 because the hounds are dead by 4 and probably 3. But the main change is that previously you used to be able to GA2 these. So turn 1, you'd GA2, you'd move, you'd probably recover an item, and then you'd sit back. And then turn 2, you would GA2 them and try and tie up 2 models, or engage and kill some people. Now, obviously, because you're going to be at GA1, it's going to push your activation count up, which means that the team's going to be able to position better on Turning Point 1. Do I think this is good? I generically do. And I think the reason is that I reckon having the extra activation is going to become more impactful than having the GA2 in Turning Point 2. I think it was cool, and you had some ability to do some quite big damage, and that was good. But actually now you're able to threat range a lot better, and against those elite teams, you have more activations to play out and wait on. Now, note if you do want to go down the GA2 route, you can just bring more Crete Warriors. They're GA2, and with the scatter guns hitting on 3s, they're not bad. But that's probably a good way of building your list so you can have more activations, particularly if you're against an 11 activation team. Being able to pump it up to 12 is a significant advantage. And the way I see this being used, in my opinion, is really in conjunction with some of the other abilities, namely Poach, which is the ability to do a mission action or a pickup action, even if you don't control it, right? So on secure missions, you have to be really careful against this sort of team, because what they'll do is they'll wait out your activations and then they'll move forwards and do a mission action for free as their last action, even if you're through APL or even if you're irrespective, right, for a CP, and steal that back from you. The way you used to play around this was try and wait out their activations and play so that they didn't have the ability to do that last, or you had the ability to then go back on and capture it afterwards. Now I'm saying you're not going to be able to do that. So that for me is a really interesting change, and I think it's going to let them do better on Turning Point 1. My concern with Crute is I think this is going to help them better play into the play style they were already doing, which was effectively a rush play style, right? So I'm going to go 4-2 on Turning Point 1. I'm going to then max all my tac ops, and there's not much you can do about it. And by Turning Point 3, I'm probably all dead, but I've got such a lead on points that you can't catch up, is kind of where they were at. So I'm interested to see how that plays out, but I think it's probably a good thing. Generically, going to 12 activations is a strength increase rather than a decrease. and access to GA2 is still there if you want it, albeit in a slightly different format. Although I don't necessarily think the Hounds are particularly stronger than, say, a generic Warrior in the first place. So you can probably have room for both, right? So interesting change there. The other change to Kroot is the Tracker Operatives abilities, both marked for the hunt and from the eye above actions. Previously, you couldn't perform those actions whilst within 6 inches of an enemy operative. I'm not really too sure why that existed. It was just like an odd thing that only this team had. But now they've made it engagement range, which is pretty consistent across the board of every other team. So this is good. This is good for beginners. This is good for more experienced players. It makes the team a lot easier to play, and is in my opinion, a straight up benefit to the team, which is cool. So Kroot, some really interesting changes that are going on here. Do I think it's going to necessarily help them too much? No, I don't think it's changing their playstyle. I don't think it's changing where they're weak. But I do think that where Kroot are going to benefit right now is all the other changes that we have seen. All right, so I don't necessarily think that Kroot are going to be the strongest thing ever. I think they're now probably got quite a few options within their team as to how they play. It looks like they're being forced more melee focused, forced more into the initial rush, which is fine. But what I think is more impactful for Kroot players is a lot of the teams you're up against are getting weaker. So that for me is like a really interesting change for people to be able to focus on at least. Okay, so next we're into the higher-tech circle, and there has again been quite a lot of significant changes. And this is, for me, I think a good way or a good approach that they've taken with this team. So I'm a big fan of these changes. They have given with one hand, taken with the other, because they're aware that there was some feel bad mechanics that this team had, that both for the player playing them and for the player that was playing against you, that they were sort of reliant on to be able to win their games, and they have changed those and hopefully given people the ability to have different ways of going forward. So the first change is the reanimation protocol's ability now works on a 2+. This is a good benefit, I think. It used to work on a 3+. I can still see the amount of times that it's probably not going to work, but that's just the way of life. You'll be rolling ones. It's just the same as those jump tests. But the rest of the changes that they made to it remains the same. So D3+3 wounds, you can get placed within 3 inches of the token, and with an order of your choice. So all good changes there. But the main thing obviously is that you get back up on a 2+, so far more likely that you're going to be seeing your guys coming back on the following turn. The next thing that they changed is a Chronomancer's counter-temporal nanomine. It used to be red, so 6 inches. Now it's blue, or 3 inches. Sorry, pentagon or square. Again, up to you, onto your metrics of choice. But it used to be 6, now it's 3. So the sort of the effect is that 6 inches either side of the token is a circle of 12 inches. That's now down to a circle of 6 inches, and that is a huge reduction in like volume of area, right? That this affects. So that's really good. The other change, they've said, is subtract 2 from the distance it can move to a minimum of 4. So that's a good start. And note, dash actions would therefore be unaffected. So this used to work where it had no restriction to a minimum. So it would be a huge area. It would take 2 from your normal move. It would take 2 from your dash, and suddenly all your guys would just crawl around the battlefield, barely able to get out of your deployment zone because they got first turn and they just rushed up and yeeted this thing out there. So a good change, I think, because that was a real feel bad to play against. In the same way that your model's not reanimating was a real feel bad to play with, right? So good change here. And it's going to force people to use other Chronomancers, other Cryptex rather than just the Chronomancer. So speaking of, they have changed them. So the Technomancer's operatives' rights of reanimation. So delete the first paragraph. Second paragraph becomes an ability. In other words, it no longer requires operative to perform an action, but subtract 1 from the Technomancer's operative's APL if you use that ability. What this means is, right, so in the past, you had to spend an action point to turn this ability on, right? And then it would hang around until you next moved your Technomancer, because they extended when it would work till. And that meant you could effectively move across the map and reanimate models that died nearby to you. Cool. Now, if they die, you just get to do it. You don't have to turn it on. It's a passive ability that's on your datasheet, and you effectively get like a medic ability within 6 inches, but a reanimate medic ability, if that makes sense. So just something to be aware of. That's, I think, quite a good change. Again, because it means that you're not necessarily wasting APL if your models aren't dying, so on Turning Point 1 or Turning Point 2, and you're not wasting your Cryptomancer's, or your Technomancer's ability on activating that. It's just a passive that the Technomancer has, which is good, because I think, it was weird that the Chronomancer, which isn't in the box that you get initially, but the Technomancer is, I think that's right, was the better option, so you had to go out and get something else. But now, obviously, this means that actually the Technomancer does the job that you want it to do, and it's somewhat APL efficient, because they still have those other abilities that they probably do want to be spending their AP on. Well, maybe not the first one, but so they have the ability to regain wounds on models, and the ability to make people reanimate with more wounds and ignore injury, which again is quite impactful. Next, we have a change to the Psychomancer and their Conjure Trauma action. So in addition, roll 1d6. If the result is higher than that enemy operative's APL, subtract 1 from that enemy operative's APL. So this isn't a way just to effectively hand out a APL debuff, as well as giving them permanent injury or basically unavoidable injury, regardless of other rules. So again, really useful against potentially elite teams, and also very likely to happen. So a lot of the APL negatives are either guaranteed in the case of, say, like Pathfinder, it's weird, or it's like a 4-up on a concussion grenade or something like that. Now, actually, against a 2 APL model, it's somewhat reliable that it's going to happen, but against your elites, it's less likely. But clearly, the power of making an elite injured is significantly more than, say, injuring a guardsman or whatever, right? So I like how that ability kind of has like a trade-off where the elite is more harmed by the first part of it, and the horde models are more harmed by potentially the second part of it. I think it makes it quite interesting, and I do like how the Mancers are now balanced against each other. So each of them have like a distinct different play style. And it'll be interesting to see how they play out. So I guess the main question from this is do we think that they are now balanced internally between each of them, and there's going to be a time that you take each of those Chronomancers, each of those Cryptex, and like will we see all 3 of them get board time? With the interesting thing to see. They have made another change as well, which is the Apprentech operative now has 3 APL, and this I think is really significant. So this was an elite team that really struggled with its APL efficiency, and it struggled to be able to both play the objective, get its buffs up, move around the board, and deal damage concurrently. But that being said, it was still winning tournaments. So I'll be interested to see how this plays out, because I think the Apprentech is a great buff. And now when the team first came out, I personally didn't think you should ever take the Apprentech. I didn't think they were that interesting. I thought the abilities that the Cryptex had weren't that worthwhile. But now they're lasting till the end of the turning point. They're lasting to the next activation rather than the end of the turning point. The abilities themselves are getting better, and the model himself now being both 3 APL, additional wounds, and better ballistic skill and weapon skill. Well, suddenly, actually, the Apprentech's now a bit of a beast model. So I think now they've gone from in my opinion, probably something that you drop first to an auto include. So that's good. I think that they definitely should be. They were a special model for the team, and it was weird that one of their specialists wasn't one of those models that you wanted to take straight away. So definitely an interesting one, and I'll be interested to see how people start playing this team going forwards. Will we see more people taking the other options? I still think, in my opinion, the Technomancer might be one of the weaker of the options. I think we'll probably still see Chronomancers coming out on top. The reason for that, and this is just my opinion, is The added movement benefit that they can do with their chronometron, I think, is really, really strong. The defensive benefit of being able to have the invulnerable save is really good in certain matchups. And the nanomine is again really good in against your melee teams and that sort of stuff, of being able to slow people down in certain areas. But I'm seeing other options, and I can see where you might want to take other models should you wish to, or so, like for instance the Psychomancer or potentially the Technomancer going forwards based on the enemies that you're going against. So some interesting changes there. Overall, I think it is a buff to the team. Definitely less feel bad for your opponent, which is a benefit, if nothing else. All right, so let's move on to the next team that really needs some help, and talk about the Exaction Squad. And oh no, there's no changes. My poor boys in the Exaction Squad are going to suffer for another 3 months until the next Dataslate, which is a real shame. I'm not bitter about it; it's fine. I'm totally fine with it. All right, let's talk about Hearthling Salvages in the next team, and some of the changes they've made there, because there is actually quite a few changes. And interestingly, I didn't think Hearthling Salvages needed that many changes, but they've got some buffs, which is pretty cool. The first buff let's talk about then is the Dozer Operative's Nux Smash, which is add the following sentence. This operative can then perform a free charge action up to 3 inches, even if it performs an action during this activation that prevents it from doing so. Now, this is pretty cool, because what it lets you do is you can charge in with your Dozer, you can punch someone off for an objective, you can then charge back onto being in engagement range with them, so safe from being shot, and then loot the objective once they don't have any APL on the objective, or secure it, whatever you want to do. Or potentially another option with this is if you, I'm assuming you do the free fight or the free shoot with this guy, or you give him an extra APL, but either way, or you charge, you Nux Smash them, you push them away, you charge back into them, doing mortal wounds and damage, and then you can immediately fight them again and do more damage to them, which is pretty cool. But the way I think this is going to be used predominantly is moving those models around the board where you want them to go, particularly off of objectives, and reducing the APL control of an objective to then be able to get control. So you might see this, so when you have like a horde team, they put, let's say, 2 models that are 2 APL each on objective. You can APL buff your Dozer, you can then move in, you can punch one of them off of the objective and then charge into the other one potentially. And that's quite a cool little way of doing it. Or you can tie up another model by going into them. So it's a cool way of doing damage, moving models around, and keeping a Dozer safe. And the Dozer was probably one of the weaker of the salvage operatives, in my opinion. So good to see that they've got some abilities. The Locator now is really, really strong. So 2 changes. First change is, in addition, so this is the early detection ability. In addition, the enemy operatives cannot move until the firefight phase of the first turning point. This is going to shut down a whole bunch of people's abilities to move their models forwards in the strategic phase. You know, you're talking like Corsairs, their Plunderers, Into the Breach, the Shush Ploy. Like, there's so many teams. In fact, the Revelatum from Exaction Squad, the boys needed a nerf. They're going to be hit by this as well. So, like, all of these sorts of teams, they're already hit by the original one, to be fair, but all of these teams are going to be hit by this ability, and it's really going to slow down your opponent's ability to get into the kill zone early. The way this benefits the salvages is, obviously, we all know they're quite a slow team, even with the +1 to their move that they got in one of the previous balanced data slates. So what it effectively means is that you're also slowing down your opponent's move potential, which means that although you're going to be slower, they're going to be slower, and therefore those mid-range objectives are just going to feel a little bit further away. I think against some teams this is going to be amazing. For instance, against like let's say Vet Guard with the standard like loot matchup, that used to be an absolute abomination, because they can probably reach all of the mid objectives because they can dash forwards, and then they would be within a single move and a loot action with a GA2 operative on turning point 1, and there was nothing you could do about it, and they'd be taken up 4T if they got initiative. Well, now if that objective isn't within 6 inches of their deployment zone, then they're not going to be able to achieve that. So that's a really strong buff to the Locator, but it doesn't stop there. Like that in itself would be significant, but they want to add a little bit more. So the pan-spectral scan action gains that the enemy operative is not obscured for that shooting attack. So you first have to ask yourself, what does that actual pan-spectral scan action do? Effectively, you can place a token anywhere in the kill zone, and then until the end of the turning point, each time you make a shooting attack against an enemy operative within 3 inches of that token, that operative doesn't get any cover, so the no cover keyword is applied, and now they're not going to be obscured. This is really interesting, right? Because you're placing a token down. There's effectively like a 6-inch bubble, right? So three either side, and anyone within that now is now not going to get cover, and anyone within that is not going to be obscured. That's pretty cool, because you might know where, let's say, an angle is on Into the Dark, for instance, and it's not like you just go, I'm going to specify that exact model right there. No, you can place this anywhere in the kill zone, and anyone who goes within that 3-inch bubble, either side, like, you can now shut down. So on things like Into the Dark, this can be really, really strong, in my opinion, for enabling you to get shots early on and denying guard actions in certain areas, so you can then achieve the one-way obscurity shot. So this is a significant buff, and we haven't seen, I don't think yet. Actually, I guess the GNC, the Cult guy, said the Wormblade has something similar for an area of lacking obscurity, but tighter model. But being able to place a token of I ignore obscurity in this area is pretty cool. So that, I think, is a great buff. It's another means of ignoring obscurity for the team. Weirdly, I think the Harkin salvages, they're not the best at long range shooting. They're actually better at close range shooting, which is somewhat counterintuitive to their movement potential. But this might mean that you see things like the High Las auto rifle, which is the 4 attacks, 3-4 relentless rending gun that they have on one of their gunners. But the fact that it's the relentless is what I'm sort of focusing on here. That might suddenly become slightly more interesting, right? Because now you can have that ignore obscurity as well, and that's where you want to be using the range benefit that you're going for, right? So you can obviously stack it with the ability to place the reroll token, that sort of stuff. But just some interesting changes there. I'm seeing how this could be used. I think your Thane probably wants to have a long range option to be able to make use of this as well, because they hit on 3s. So you want to try and force some long range damage options out of your kill team, and this could be a good way of achieving that. So whereas previously it was only on the rotary cannon, which obviously had heavy tag to it, which restricted its ability to do too much. Salvages, really interesting. I didn't think they were going to get buffs, if I'm honest. Out of all the teams that I would have thought would be getting changes or buffs, I didn't think Hearthkin were that far behind the other teams, but I guess they are. It seems odd to me that Exaction didn't get buffs, but Hearthkin did. Between the two, I would probably think Exaction are the weaker of the teams. So that's an interesting thing for me. But maybe that's just me or my bias from my play experience. But I'll play a few more games of Hearthkin and see how I feel, I guess. But I know some of the players he played them quite regularly, and they're performing pretty well with them now. So it'll be interesting to see. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is the Felgor Ravagers. So 4 changes here. I'll start with the first one, which is the Ironhorn. They call the attack ability. The selected operative must be visible to and within 6 inches or red pentagon of this operative. So for those of you who don't know, the Ironhorn's call the attack ability is their ability to issue a dash, effectively a strategic phase dash, to a whole bunch of models. Not now for the Hearthkin though, not with the locator. But what it used to be is just visible, right? So that meant that you could move whole groups of goats forwards really, really quickly and really, really easily. And all this has done is constrain the range in which you can do it. It's a bit of a nerf. I mean, every now and then you would see the Ironhorn want to dash a different group of goats to the other side of the board. But generically, you can probably just figure out where you want the guys that you want to be more aggressive with and put them within 6 of your leader, and that probably won't be too impactful. The next change is a change to the Gnarl Scar. So they have the uncompromising attack action. This is now, you can only select an auto pistol for this action shooting attack. So the technique that used to be applied with this, so the Gnarlscar can effectively, for 1 AP, do a shoot and a fight, even within engagement range. So you give them a crack grenade and their sort of their bionic fist, and then either they would, if they were fighting a really tough enemy, they would throw the crack grenade into the enemy's face and do a bunch of damage, then fight them with the bionic fist and kill them, or they would fight a weaker enemy with the bionic fist, kill them, then throw a crack grenade at someone else to enable effectively a double kill. So I think this is a good change, to be honest. This is probably in line with what you've seen happen for such as the things like the Dakka Boy, where in the past a Dakka Boy got the option to shoot and then dash, and then people were using the dynamite option, so they would be able to get a free dynamite out and all this sort of stuff. Clearly that's not what they necessarily intended, and it just reduces the damage potential of the Gnarlscar, particularly against elites or against a single tough model, which is, I think, a positive change for this team, because they were performing slightly too well. The next change then is to some of their equipment, and the Warpaint equipment is now 2 EP rather than 1 EP. This is pretty significant, right? Because Warpaint, for those of you who don't know, lets the Felgor Ravagers ignore all modifiers that operatives' movement and APL characteristics. And now they're going to be able to find that a little bit harder to spam, per se, because they'd usually take about, I don't know, 7 of them with a crack grenade. Occasionally they might take something else, but most of the time people would just take that. So that's a good change, because the Warpaint itself is really strong. I personally wonder if a better way of solving this team would be to have reduced what the Warpaint actually does. So either make it ignore movement or ignore APL, rather than both, because a good way of playing around a melee team is messing with their APL modifiers, and we've just seen that they're trying to add that to teams like Hyrotech Circle being able to make someone -1 APL. So if you could do that to this team, then you can remove their melee threat without having to worry about it too much. So that sadly isn't going to be the case, and they're still going to have quite a few of these. And I guess it will make them some of the equipment choices internally in their codex a little bit better, which in a way, again, for the internal balance of the, I say codex then, obviously it's not a codex, it's a data sheet or whatever you want to call it. But like it's going to, force their internal balance to be a little bit better with their equipment choices, which is, I think, a positive. Okay, and lastly, I think this should be like an errata thing. It's a balanced data set thing, which is fine, I guess. But the Death Knell Operative's Wargong ability, no effect when the Death Knell Operative has a Frenzy token. So effectively what the Wargong ability is each time an attack dice would inflict critical damage on a friendly Felgor Ravager operative within 3 inches of this operative, you can choose that attack dice to inflict normal damage instead. So it's a good way of protecting your models from getting schwacked when they were frenzied, because you could use the Wargong ability to make the critical damage that they would have come into normal damage, so that they couldn't be shot and killed with critical damage. So an interesting way of protecting your frenzied bodies. But now obviously if you frenzy the Death Knell, that isn't going to be a factor, so you can kill the Death Knell once they've been frenzied by shooting them, which is a positive, but you can also kill some of the guys that might be hanging around them by killing them first as well. So interesting changes there. Do we think that this is going to be enough to reduce how Felgor Ravagers play, and are we going to see them topping less tournaments as a result? No, I don't think we are. I think they still have a lot of abilities here that are going to help them a lot, that haven't really been touched. I think what could be more impactful for them than what's shown here on this data slate is dependent upon how much the community pick up Beta Decima. And I think that's a map that they probably struggle on a little bit, although with the changes that have been made, I think Beta Decima is now more favourable to this team. So I think the kill zone differential that they had before is probably lessened, and the changes are nerfs, but not particularly strong nerfs. And it's an interesting one, because for instance, what hasn't been touched in this balanced data slate is something like Gellerpots Infected, which I think a lot of people know are a very strong team, and a lot of these melee teams are still doing quite well. And I'll be interested to see how this meta sort of plays out over the next few months, because I can see these changes, although they are somewhat impactful, I don't think they're going to get down to the core of why these teams win more than others, if that makes sense. Maybe that's just my gut reaction, but that's how I feel. I think what you'll see as a result is the Iron Horn will be more focused on the group that wants to move forward, so they'll probably bias them towards where the majority of the objectives are, or their main thrust that they want to achieve. They'll be more defensive with the Death Knell, keeping it on conceal more to be able to reduce your likelihood of killing them, so they can keep other models around that Death Knell alive even when frenzied. And the Null Scar getting the crack grenade will probably just go to someone else instead. So I'm not sure who on the team will get the crack grenade. I guess it doesn't really matter, but they'll look to give it to a different model than that one per se. Because, well, I don't know, actually, maybe they won't. I guess one of the ones that might make sense would be... No, actually, I'm just thinking about it this way. No, I don't think there is. So, yeah, anyway, we'll see what comes out from it. I guess my main point is Felgors are a strong team. They're doing really well. I'm not sure this is necessarily going to have the requirement to take them down to a lower level. But maybe that is just me. Okay, next we're talking about the Chaos Cult in the Ashes of Faith box and some changes there as well. So they have 2 changes made to them. The first change is the Winged Accursed Gift. You need to delete the first bullet point. For those of you wondering what the Winged Accursed Gift is, effectively the first bullet point is ignore any or all modifiers to its movement characteristic. The second bullet point is where it can ignore the first distance of 2 inches it travels for a climb, a drop, or a traverse. So, this is actually, I think, pretty impactful. Not because of it in isolation to itself, but because of the previous nerfs that the team have received. So for those that weren't tracking in the last balanced data slate, effectively how many wounds an operative comes back with is now randomized. And they get either D3+1 if they're becoming a mutant, or D3+3 if they're becoming a torment, which means that you can do damage to them, or they can receive damage in a fight. And when they mutate, they might not necessarily come back with all of their wounds. Interestingly, I think this means that we'll probably see more injured torments and or mutants going forwards. And this used to be a way to get around it for their movement penalty. So they would make them winged, they'd ignore traverse, they'd be able to ignore the fact they were injured, and they would have a very significantly large threat bubble that was very hard to manage. Note that they can still add 1 to their movement ranges, which is going to be a way to get around this, which will probably get taken more frequently. It depends on the board state more than anything else, I think, and how many routes are blocked by traverse versus free lanes for them to move down. But let's say if it's an open board, they're probably going to force people to go down to fleet for add-on movement. But if you have wounded models, it's going to see an impact there where it used to be an easy option to take winged. You'd be just ignoring that and going forwards, but now at least you won't be. So I think this is going to probably force more people to look at some of the other options. I'm not saying that they're going to go down it necessarily. I think it still does make sense. Like if you're on a very compressed board where all of the movement routes have been restricted by barricades and someone's done very good defensive barricades, you're probably still going to look to take winged because you need that movement potential to be able to get over those barricades and get to where you need to go, and therefore the 2 inches that gives you is greater than the 1 inch that you would get elsewhere. But if it's a very open board and people are able to just move around without any real hassle, then you're probably not necessarily going to see too much difference. The other thing that you will notice is there's operative selection, 1 less devotee operative. This, I think the way this works out is you end up with 1 less activation on turning point 1. I might be doing my maths wrong, and it is late at night, but I'm pretty sure that the general outcome will be that you end up with slightly less models, less activations on turning point 1, and also there's less models on the board. And I do think this is probably a good change for the team. I think having that many models on the board was made it really hard to play an effective trading game into them, particularly when they come back so strong, and if you don't kill them, they can regain health and that sort of stuff. It just makes it a little bit easier for teams, or more manageable for teams to deal with, particularly if you're not a very killy team and you can't necessarily get the required amount of kills that you need to. 15 bodies was a lot to chew through. So now reducing their activation count, making them more likely to drop those activation brackets going forwards. I acknowledge that they're going to mutate stuff and go up, but it does help. Is probably a good thing for them. Again, these have been a somewhat light touch. I think that's probably the most impactful out of the nerfs to the melee teams. I think Chaos Cults got hit, in my opinion, it seems harder than the Felgor Ravagers, which is odd because originally Chaos Cult were performing significantly better, but now I believe Chaos Cult are performing worse than the Felgor Ravagers, stats-wise at least. But I guess it depends what you care or don't care about when it comes to stats versus sort of like feels on the table. So let's just summarise, because there's been a whole bunch of changes. I think overall this is a good balanced data slate. I think it's hit a lot of what it needed to. I'm really glad that they've addressed Killzone Beta Decima in the balanced data slate. I didn't know if they would do that as an errata or as part of the balanced data slate. I wasn't too sure how it was going to go ahead, but it was obviously quite apparent that it somewhat needed to happen, because I don't want to say it was unplayable, but it just wasn't playing well. I'm going to try and have some games probably on Friday on the original Beta Decima, no scatter terrain, with the new rules, see how it plays, and then give a verdict. And then also I have a tournament on Saturday. Is it Sunday? Saturday? At the weekend. I have a tournament at the weekend in Nottingham where I'm going to be able to it's Saturday. It's Saturday. Anyway, not that you care. But the point being is I'm going to do that, and I'll see how they play, hopefully ahead of that time, and give you some immediate feedback from the balanced data slate from a bunch of competitive players, and see if what they think about it, because they'll all be reading it over probably between now and the weekend, and they're going to have their opinions, and it'll be good to see what they think. I'll also try and see if I can get some players on from various areas to talk about some of the changes, because there's a whole bunch of really interesting changes that have come here, and there's players I know that have a lot more deep faction knowledge in each of these areas than I do. I try to play a lot of teams, but I don't play as much as some people do. So I'm going to try and lean on the experts where I can. I'll try and get them on the podcast going forward. So stand by, listen for that. Hopefully we'll try and make it as good as we can do. Last few things, if you've been listening to this podcast, and one of those teams has really stood out to you, and you think to yourself, you know what, I'm going to go and pick myself up some Warp Coven. I'm going to get myself all the box sets of Sorcerers and Rubik Marines and Zangors and all that sort of good stuff, or whatever it's going to be. Just remember that we do have some affiliate links. It's a great way of just supporting the channel whilst you do your standard purchases. So you can find those in the video description, and just go ahead and just go and buy your stuff through that link, and it gives a bit of kickback to us. And it's a way of passively supporting the channel, whilst also hopefully getting you a discount on making your purchase a little bit cheaper. This has all been my opinion, though. I'm excited to hear what you guys think, because, wow, there is a lot, right? So please leave some comments. What do you think's the best change? What do you think's the worst change? What changes would you have liked to have seen that didn't get included? Because I'm guaranteed there's going to be quite a few. There is some that I am surprised about. For instance, Exaction Squad didn't get touched. Not really too sure why. That was one of the teams that I thought were almost guaranteed a buff, but there we go. I think it's definitely, we're heading in the right direction. I love how invested GW is in continually improving the game and making it better, which is a big positive. And I'm going to go and watch now the bat rep for the new kill teams, and hopefully I'll give you some feedback on that when I've processed all that as well. So this has been me. Hopefully it was helpful, and I'll see you guys in the comment section. Take it easy. That brings us to this episode. Hopefully you found something new or useful while listening. If you did, throwing us a like would be greatly appreciated, and share this with your friends so they can benefit as well. If you want to make sure you don't miss any episodes, make sure to hit subscribe and select the bell icon so you get notifications as soon as the next episode drops. It really is the best way to help a small channel like ours. If you can't wait and you do want early access, you can join the Patreon, where you get exclusive access to all of our content ahead of time, as well as exclusive videos, access to the Discord, and tournament rewards. If you are an existing patron, let me take this moment once again to say a massive thank you for your support. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so drop a comment below and we'll get right to you. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host Ryan. This has been Turning Point Tactics, and we'll see you next time.